Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Ben and this is the UnchartedX Podcast, episode 6.5, I guess. This is part 2 of my 2-part series interviewing Antonio Zamora. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd highly recommend checking out part 1 before diving into part 2, as we start this conversation after already talking for an hour. In part 1, we had an overview of the Carolina Bays, took a little bit of a look at their history, compared them with other types of oriented lakes that you can find on the planet. We also examined some of the evidence that the Carolina Bays were tightly coupled to the Younger Dryas, and we took an overview of Antonio's hypothesis that covers the formation of the Carolina Bays as essentially splash damage from Younger Dryas Cosmic Impacts that likely hit the ice sheet, and then just ejected these gigantic chunks of ice on ballistic suborbital trajectories that landed in the Carolinas region as well as the Nebraska region. Everything points up at the impact point in the Great Lakes area, and all of these lakes are oriented in the same way, and we can mathematically fit ellipses over all of the lake shapes, which gives us a lot of clues as to their formation. In this video, part 2, we'll take a look at some of his proof for his theory, and in particular the experiments that Antonio's been doing to prove out his results. We'll take a look at some specific impact mechanisms as well as the dating around the Carolina Bays. This is the real controversial aspect of his theory, and he addresses all of the criticism against it, at least to my mind. And then we take a minute to examine whether or not the formation of the Carolina Bays had something to do with the incredible amount of megafaunal extinction that was going on in that area at that time. I hope you guys enjoy the podcast. It was certainly a very enjoyable discussion for me. I learned a ton, and I'd like to thank Antonio for taking the time to speak with me. I really do appreciate it. Please remember to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Visit Antonio's YouTube page. He's got a lot of great stuff on there. I'd recommend checking that out if any of these topics are of interest to you. And also, please do consider supporting UnchartedX via the value for value model. You can find out all of the ways to do that at unchartedx.com/support. Enjoy the podcast. Yeah.
Okay, now let's take a look at some of the associated things. Go to which is right here. One of the predictions that I made in my publication was that the overturned flaps of the Carolina Bays would have inverted stratigraphy. I didn't know at the time, but which was 2017 when my paper got published. But 5 years earlier, in 2012, Ted Bunch and other people from the Comet Research Group had published something that showed inverted stratigraphy in a Carolina Bay rim.
Oh. Right.
And you can see here on the left, at a depth of 107 centimeters, you have a date of 11.5 kiloi, which is 1,000 years.
Yep. Plus
okay,
or minus
152, right, plus or minus 1, okay, so it's like, 11 or 12, yeah. Or 11 or 10, yes. And then at 152, you have the 18.54, at 183, 12.96. Hey, that at 152, 18.54, that's very old. As a matter of fact, in that publication, they were trying to get an average age for the what they were digging into, and they said this is anomalous. It's so anomalous that we will report it, but not consider it in our inclusion. So it stayed in the index, and one of my colleagues, Adam Glass, who died earlier this year, made this discovery. He read this paper so carefully and found that evidence of inverted stratigraphy. I then contacted Ted Bunch. He says, hey, you're doing good research. That's so it was satisfying to me that one of the predictions of the glacier ice impact hypothesis had come true. The other prediction is that some ice boulders will contain clasts from the land up in Michigan, and that those clasts will be found in the Carolina Bays. although if the ice came from the top of the glacier, there's probably there are no stones or clasts. But if the material came from the bottom of the glacier, definitely.
With it. Yeah.
Yes. And so that still has to be proven. But at least one of the ideas is there.
Yep.
And when you take a look at this slide, I included.
This slide still? Yeah.
No. Yes. When you take a look at this inclusion that I have there for Professor Melosh, it shows the inverted stratigraphy. And when you have flat ground, everything at the top may be like 12,000.9, and then you will have the flipping over, and you're putting this 18.54 layer on top, and then you have additional layering on top, which ends up at 11.5. And so this creates this
anomalous result.
Anomalous stratigraphy, yes.
I'm just imagining this impact. It makes sense. You can see how it would fold that like deeper layers and up on top, and that's why it's hard to. Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Yeah.
The image from Professor Melosh is from his book Impact Cratering. So, okay, you can go to the next slide. And this is basically, some people ask, what's liquefaction? Well, and why are we concerned with liquefaction? In order to make a conical cavity, you need special conditions, one of which is you have to have a viscous surface. You cannot have a hard surface. And liquefaction occurs when you have vibrations of in unconsolidated soil close to the water table. The vibrations suspend the dirt particles in the water, creating swampy or conditions, basically a viscous fluid. And here you can see a modern car being put into a soil layer that probably was deposited several thousand years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So this is one of the reasons why I'm very skeptical about this stratigraphical dating, and we'll get into the dating.
Because you think that liquefaction happened in these Carolina Bays to form them.
Liquefaction happens through normal vibrations of the ground under earthquake conditions, and the soil layers get mixed up. And so you're going to find artifacts from a young date in an old layer. Or what you think is an old layer.
The example here would be, imagine that if it's 1,000 years later and this was all covered in dirt and somebody saw the tail light of this car sticking out and they dug down and they're like, wow, this car's embedded in these layers that goes down to 25,000 years ago. And liquefication is...
They got cars, yes. So...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
and so the next is, this was one of my first experiments, okay? This one, oblique impacts on clay.
Yep.
When I started communicating with Michael Davies, I said, hey, I'm thinking that this may be the case. And, it was just a little quick experiment, threw a few pebbles into some clay and then show the viscous relaxation. And this actually reminds me of when I was a kid and there were some bricklayers next door mixing some
mortar.
Mortar, yes. And I remember throwing some rocks into the and watching all these craters form. And so, but see, one of the interesting things is that these are impacts, okay?
Yeah.
But they are not covered in that impact cratering book from Professor Melosh, okay? The conical cavities were not found in any of the references that I saw, and they were not reported in the literature. The only reference that I found about any conical crater structure was about the Lynn crater on the moon. This was the only reference to a conical impact cavity. And so basically I had to invent everything that I knew or that I had learned from my experiments. In the next figure, I wanted to make, next slide, I wanted to make something more realistic or similar to the Carolina Bays. Yeah. And if you use only the sand from the Carolina Bays that I had collected, it just is solid. Yeah. You add water, it's solid. You cannot liquefy it, okay? Right. And so all the experiments that I tried on the Carolina Bay, the dirt basically just bounced off. I needed to be able to suspend the sand in a way that would create this viscous surface. And what I did was just use some clay, pottery clay and water. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see I added a little layer of sand, and you can see the inclined conical cavities, the view from the top, matching with the using the ellipsis to try to look at it.
Is that actually ice that you've shot into that as well?
Yes. I want it to be as close as possible.
That's cool.
And something interesting that I found out. See, if you flip back to the slide S24.
24, yep.
Yeah, take a look at the bottom right. Something that I found was, notice the little piece of ice is floating.
Yeah.
See, this gives me hope that if the same thing happened with the formation of the Carolina Bays, because ice has a lower density than the liquefied soil, that the ice boulders floated after making the impact cavity, and that we might find those clasts not so deep within the Carolina Bays at the apex.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, and clasts being the soil and rocks from as identifiable from Michigan. Yeah.
That is correct. Okay.
Yeah.
So now when we go to slide 32, which is the next one, it just I wanted to just say, okay, what happens when I have
overlap
or adjacent conical cavities? Do I create overlapping bays? And sure enough,
there it is. And we see this in the actual form of the bays too, right? They do overlap, which makes sense from a bombardment perspective.
That's right. Not only that, when there are certain weaknesses, you can see that the forward edge of that resulting bay
on the right
has a broader lip or broader a rim, which is something that is observed in the Carolina Bays. Yeah. And so the next slide basically just shows you some Carolina Bays that are overlapping in perfect elliptical shape. And so the experiments give me confidence that something is right about the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Okay, now the next slide, 34, shows a stratigraphic restoration experiment. A lot of researchers have found that the Carolina Bays do not show evidence of disruption under them.
Right.
And so I wanted to design an experiment to show that the viscous relaxation restores the stratigraphy.
It kind of does, doesn't it? It just fills in.
Yes, and so here you see, and number one, you see the ice projectile. Mm-hmm. And then as the cavity is reduced by viscous relaxation, this requires shaking the container during the experiment, okay? You have this vibration. All this bombardment all across, so you have all this ground shaking, keeping the ground liquefied. So you're vibrating the container. Yep. And notice in number two, you already see less of that red layer. And finally, number four, that layer has been restored. It's like what happens is the cavity is filled from the bottom up in the reverse order in which it's formed. And so it never is 100% complete. because of friction and
right, and so we're saying that the source of the vibration in the context of the Carolina Bays was the actual bombardment itself, because that it hit so many places that it actually shook the ground like a big earthquake that went on for 30 seconds,
right.
a couple minutes, whatever. Yeah, and this was
in the Carolina
stratigraphy. Yeah.
No, the Carolina Bays had a bombardment from 6 minutes to 9 minutes after the extraterrestrial event.
Okay, so a few minutes. Yeah.
The actual ejection of this ballistic trajectories was 30 seconds. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
But then we got to experiments by other people, which is the experiment by Raymond Kocharovsky, who did this for his thesis. I don't know if a master's or PhD, but he was at the University of South Carolina. And his paper has been accepted as a reference for much of the Aeolian-Lacustrian hypothesis. In the sense,
so what's that? So just what's the Aeolian-Lacustrian hypothesis?
Aeolian means wind, Lacustrian like lake. So Aeolian, wind and water, okay?
Wind and water erosion, yeah.
Yes. And so what he did, he set up an experiment. He made a round pool in a sand table, and then for 15 minutes at a time, he had a fan blowing one way, and then he reversed direction, blowing the other way. And at the end, he ended up with this football-shaped sort of lake or pool. And in his thesis, he describes this as elliptical, but it's obviously not elliptical. It's more football-shaped.
Yeah.
Yes. And I have a video where I look at his thesis. His thesis was never peer-reviewed, never published, but it has been referenced widely in the literature that proposes this wind and water hypothesis formation.
Right.
And then the next image, this is
the ice.
This is the ice. These are experiments by Professor Schultz from Brown University. And he uses the Ames vertical gun to fire little pebbles, little beads into ice sheets and sand. Okay, so he can compare it, impacts on sand and impacts protected by an ice sheet. And he says, if you had an impact on a sheet of ice, the ice sheet would protect the underground, the sand underground, and you would not have any evidence of an impact. You know, you have the water and the melting, and in a few thousand years, all that evidence would be gone. Right. But what is important here is to notice that an impact on an ice sheet creates ice pieces of all sizes.
Yeah,
and so this is why, so you see some big ones and you see some small ones, and there's probably some that are like dust. Yes.
Yeah, and we get into this too, where as another result of those impacts onto ice is that you get a lot of these smaller particles thrown up and actually just put into orbit, effectively like low Earth orbit, and they upper atmosphere, and they contribute to the cooling effect.
Yes, but I think more than that is the water that gets carried by the ice boulders. You know, when you have that big shock that breaks up the ice, all those surfaces grinding against each other will melt the water at the contact points. And so that water will end up in space where, because of the thermodynamics of water, which we'll get into, can only form ice crystals.
Right.
So the next slide basically looks at some of the mathematics of the glacier ice impact hypothesis. And I basically start with showing, hey, you know, these are perfect ellipses. You can fit elliptical equations on them if you want to. And so even the ancient Greeks knew that ellipses are conic sections. And so it's very logical to say that the Carolina bays, because they are conic sections, originated from inclined conical cavities.
Right.
And
which indicates an inclined ballistic sort of impact, right? This is the coral relation. Yeah.
And so this is the image that I chose for my book.
Solving
the mystery of the Carolina bays.
Yeah.
And it's actually close to Baltimore, North Carolina. And this little building that you see here at the bottom right is the Hoke Livestock Farms.
And they're probably quite large.
Those are block-long buildings,
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the next slide shows some of the ballistic calculations. Mm-hmm. You have one for distance, time of flight, maximum height. Basically, we know the distance because we can measure on Google Earth the distance between Saginaw Bay and any Carolina Bay.
Yep.
But this enables us to find the velocity. Okay, so that top equation we use for finding the velocity.
Yep.
And you can see here that if we take like 1,000 kilometers or 1470 kilometers, we get speed like from 3.1 to 3.9 kilometers per second. And time flights from 6.3 to 9.1 minutes.
And a max height of 350 plus. Oh, man.
Yeah, notice the heights, okay?
Yeah.
150 kilometers for the shallowest angle, 35 degrees.
That's ballistic.
And for 45 degrees at higher speed, 368 kilometers. And I was thinking, how high is that international station?
Isn't it at 400? Something like that?
Yes. But some of those particles might have reached up there,
Oh, you see it coming.
In other words, if this happened today, some of those satellites would come down.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be the least of our problems, I'd imagine. But that
I see my screen got blurry. Is that?
It's fine here. It might just be a bandwidth for you thing, okay. But I'm recording here locally, so it's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So anyway, those maximum heights. Initially, I did not recognize the importance of that. But, I was walking out thinking about Carolina bays and the ballistic equations. And I said, wow, all of these are suborbital space flights. Mm-hmm. This means that those pieces of ice were up above the atmosphere because the atmosphere only goes to 100 kilometers above the surface of the Earth.
Yep.
And so this has great implications about
the water.
That these were solid chunks of ice, because you cannot have any water above 35 kilometers from the surface of the Earth because the pressure is too low. Water can only exist as a solid or a gas.
Yeah.
So then the next slide shows the calculator from Professor Melosh and Ross Bayer, which was then at the University of Arizona. Mm-hmm. It still is, but the link has changed. For a while, it had been deleted when Professor Melosh went from Arizona to Purdue. This disappeared, but later it reappeared under Ross Bayer's ID.
Page.
But the important thing here is that we can use, by looking at the area of an ellipse and correlating it with an area of a circle, we can use this calculator to estimate the size and energy of the ice boulders.
Right.
First, we get the energy, and the size comes from the density, because, and like, for example, here it shows that a 1 kilometer crater of a Carolina Bay of 1 kilometer.
Yep.
With an impact of 3 kilometers per second, would require an ice boulder
Around
with
100
an energy of 3.3 megatons.
Right.
3.03 megatons. And the diameter is 180 meters.
It's a big old piece of ice.
Yes. Take a look at slide 41, okay? Just to skip there for a minute. Okay, we'll go back next. Yeah, this one. This one gives you a perspective. You have a small bay on the right that says 13 kilotons. This is like the size of 2 football fields, okay? 200 meters.
Mm-hmm.
13 kilotons. The ice boulder that made that had to be like the infield of a baseball park. In other words, from
Yep.
the infield of baseball. Whereas the one on the left, the big one of 1 kilometer, required 3 megatons of energy to form. And the ice boulder that made it was the size of Yankee Stadium. Okay?
Yeah, it's a
big chunk of ice.
Frightening. You know what's even more frightening, and I don't know if you get here in these slides, but I know you then worked backwards from like how many Carolina bays there were to like what would it take for the crater in the ice to eject them, and then look at, well, what was the impact to the ice? And that's...
Go back to the previous slide, okay? Because this basically summarizes. See, this shows you the empowerment of mathematics.
Yep.
You have seen, like, for example, I showed you that paper by about the Carolina bays.
Yep.
And there are some that estimate how many tons of spherules were ejected and so forth. Well, the Carolina bays make it possible to calculate the size of the projectile and its energy and the size of the crater that it made on the ice, okay? Mm-hmm. So, and we start from the base geometry, and we
determine angles.
Is the angle of impact, which is also the launch angle, if you have something symmetrical,
yep,
is given by the width to length ratio of the bay. And then the ballistic equations require the distance to the target and the launch angles.
Yep.
Then the yield equations from Professor Melosh give you the energy of the impact. And using that energy, you can calculate the mass of the projectile, and with the density, you can calculate the volume. And all those things put together, knowing how many Carolina bays there are, you can get the total energy of the extraterrestrial impact, the mass of the ejecta, and the volume of ice. Like in this slide, we see a 44-kilometer crater in the ice that took 30 seconds to make.
Form. Yeah.
Yes. And you have the angle of 35 degrees for most of the ejecta. You see a vapor plume in water getting ejected up above the atmosphere. And impact energy of 6.35 times 10 to the 21st joules, which is a catastrophic event. Okay.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Now, the next slide shows the thermodynamics.
I was going to say too, and the size of this was around 4 kilometers. I think, wasn't that the estimation you ended up with?
Yes.
Volume. I mean, that's the volume of ice that got ejected, but the actual projectile may have been up to,
was 3 to 4 kilometers in size.
If it was a meteorite moving at a slower speed, if it was a comet that came in at a higher speed, it would have been slightly smaller. But still, I mean, that's a giant. Either way, you're either talking about a 1 kilometer or maybe a 3 or 4 kilometer meteorite. Yeah.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. And so this is a water phase diagram. Okay.
This is important to understand. Yeah.
Yes, and it shows the triple point of water, which happens at a low pressure, okay?
Yeah.
And this is the point below which water cannot exist as a liquid.
Yeah, just solid or gas.
And, yes, and so when you put water above the atmosphere, it has to turn into a gas or solid. You cannot have slush balls. You cannot have. So anybody who talks about slush balls is wrong.
Right.
It's impossible physically. The thermodynamics makes it very clear. And there are many experiments that you can see on YouTube about what happens when you put water in space.
Yeah.
The astronauts used to throw, I think it was Apollo, they used to vent their urine into space.
Yeah, urine crystals. Right?
I think Schweikert was the one who said, "Oh, it's a beautiful sight at sunset. You see all this like shooting stars." So all these crystals of ice that get formed instantly when you vent water into space. Mm-hmm. So the next slide then shows something that is very important, I think, that some of the cold event has been, the Younger Dryas cooling event has been attributed to the smoke and that block the light of the sun. But smoke is an atmospheric, it stays in the atmosphere. It's suspended in air. And so when you have rain, when you have snow, some of that smoke and dirt come back down. But orbiting ice crystals are above the atmosphere, and they will stay there until they sublimate. Right. And sublimation is a transformation of ice directly into gas. And this is one of the reasons why I think that the Younger Dryas lasted 1,300 years. And I think that that period of time can be used to calculate the amount of ice that was ejected, or of ice crystal that was up there, which corresponded to the amount of water that was out in ejected.
Yeah.
In my book, I calculated that about the same amount of water was ejected as the amount of ice that created the Carolina Bays.
So that's worth just putting into context. What we're talking about is there's the Younger Dryas corresponds to just a dramatic cooling event. So there's 12,800. All of the hypothesis around impacts. If you look at the Greenland ice cores, the temperature, certainly northern hemisphere, it is somewhat backed up by the Antarctic as well as the South American studies, but globally we look like we went back to a deep freeze, and there's a bunch of different reasons why that have been hypothesized to be a factor for that, and certainly the idea of a layer of ice crystals that reflects sunlight would definitely contribute to just dramatic cooling events. It's why I listen to some of the modern day proposals for we're going to go and inject silver particles or something into the upper atmosphere, start reflecting sunlight. I'm like, this is a very, very bad idea. Let's not go down this path.
That's right.
Our temperature, our climate is just fine. Let's not mess with it too much. We can, pollution's bad and all, but let's not start tweaking these sort of things, because historically it seems like ice and the cold is much more of an issue for life on the planet than heat. We do just fine with even more heat than where we are now. Right, we're actually just in an ice age still. It's an interglacial period. I mean, not to divert, but dinosaurs and the megafauna, the biggest periods of megafauna and megaflora. I mean, we had much higher temperatures. We had 10x the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Life just flourished, and it hasn't like it never has before on the planet. But yeah, this is what you're saying. That 1,300 year period, that deep freeze period of the Younger Dryas. You think this had something to do with that?
Yeah, I think the orbiting ice crystals is a logical explanation, and it's something that you would expect from an impact on ice, which would eject water and send all these ice boulders with water in them into low Earth orbit. And somebody challenged me, how do you know this would get into low Earth orbit? I said, well, those in order to attain low Earth orbit, you need 7 kilometers per second. Now, if you have already boulders going at 4 kilometers per second, and you may have some smaller ones that are going even faster, and they are carrying water, that water starts to evaporate, and if it's pointed in the right direction, that drop of water, some of that water is going to act as a propellant. The water acts as a propellant, which will take things into low Earth orbit. Right. And so there's a lot of, with the millions and billions of droplets, there's a lot of opportunity for creating ice crystals that end up in low Earth orbit.
Yeah.
So, the next slide, this slide is important because it shows what happened during the emplacement of the Carolina bays. It was not just like splat and we're done, okay? Yeah. Remember, there were like 6 minutes to about 9 minutes after the extraterrestrial event, there was all this bombardment, okay? So we have Kelly Bay, that is an elliptical bay with a very nice rim. And then you have this splash chevrons. And notice, this Carolina Bay is next to a little PD river. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I have proposed is that impacts on the river splashed mud onto a bay that had already formed. So you have Kelly Bay forming, and then you have a splash on the river, sends this curtain of mud, which is a splash chevron. And mm-hmm. By the way, Chris Cottrell coined the term splash chevron. Okay, splash. Yes, I was talking about splashes, and he said, "Hey, that's a good term." Chris Cottrell and I are cooperating on trying to find out if there are particles here bigger than the wind can carry, because some scientists are saying, hey, these are just aeolian deposits. The wind carried them. But if there are particles there that are bigger than the wind can carry, then these are splash chevrons and nothing else.
I'm just having flashbacks to Monty Python with the argument about, is it an African swallow or a European swallow, and can it carry a coconut or not? It's just I don't know if you ever seen it. It's just a funny Monty Python sketch about.
I was talking about the glass of water. Is it a wind-blown dust or is it splash-blown dirt?
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons why I feel that this is a splash chevron is because of the small bay. Notice there's a small bay right
here.
There.
Right here.
And then you see a lot of other small bays around there, okay, which are big enough to kill a person if they were caused by an impact.
For sure.
Yes. I don't know if you hear it, but I'm having thunderstorm outside.
No, I heard a little noise, but yeah, not too much. It's so far, the connection seems fine.
Okay. So we can now talk about the dating.
Right.
Because this is a very important topic. And basically, this is a summary of radiocarbon dating. Uh-huh. And is basically depending on the cosmic rays of the sun hitting nitrogen, creating carbon-14, which gets absorbed by the plants and then eaten by animals. And so the humans and the animals ingest the plants and get carbon-14. And so the wood or skeletons can be dated by the decay of the carbon-14 back into nitrogen.
Yeah, organic only. So it's just it's
this is all. This is
it's just organic.
This is all organic. And the next slide tells us. This is from Jake Kenneth, who did some analysis of the Younger Dryas boundary. Some of the problems with the carbon dating is that the high precision does not mean high accuracy.
Right.
And you have carbon turnover in the deep oceans, release of carbon-14 from biomass burning, vertical transport of charcoal in sedimentary sequences by bioturbation of the roots, animal digging, redeposition by wind, water, and ice. And so the next slide then shows something that I think is very funny. Well, funny, yes, but frustrating,
Right.
in that when you see dates, radiocarbon dates that are in the future, you know that either you had bad technique, which is terrible, hey, I did everything right, but if you know that you did everything right, then there's a source. Did something contaminate the sample?
Yeah.
And so you don't know what you have or what dates you have. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that carbon dating, Carolina bays, which are on terrain subject to liquefaction, is problematic. And I think this clearly shows the problem.
755 years in the future with minus 755 at depth of 30 centimeters. I know that with carbon dating, it's very important. Like you say, that's a great statement. Is that high precision doesn't mean high accuracy, and when you put carbon dates, it's important to put them into the context of that area, that region, and all of the other work that's been done around it. Right? I know that you have to kind of place the date, the results you get from the scientific procedure with dating organic remains, and you put it in the right context to understand, okay, where actually are we in terms of the timeline. I know it's a tricky business. It's not as just straightforward as people think it is.
Yes. Okay, now the next slide gets into the OSL, or optically stimulated luminescence dating. Okay? Right, and this is yes. And I'll explain it, okay? But basically, here is a paper by Brooks, Taylor, and Ivester from 2010 showing that Big Bay has multiple dates. You take a look at the inner portions of the bay, you get dates of 2.2 thousand years, and back up there you end up with dates of over 75. And so it's it cannot be. Yeah. It could not have been created all at the same time. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the conclusion. But let's take a look at how dating is. Okay. Next slide. And so, optically stimulated luminescence has specific testing requirements. You have to get a sample from at least 1 meter below the surface of the Earth, because cosmic rays can affect it. And you have to do it in something that's well stratified. And for example, here you can see in the image on the right that they're taking the sample from where you can see the layers of material. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that link shows how to get the links. So the optical luminescence is how it works is given in the next slide. Okay. So here we have that cycles of deposition and buildup. Okay. Mm-hmm. What optically stimulated luminescence measures is the electrons that are trapped in quartz crystals or feldspar from in the effects of the crystals. And these electrons get trapped from radiation, either from uranium, thorium, rubidium, potassium, radioactive elements, or from cosmic rays.
Right.
And so when material is buried, this trapped electrons build up. And then when you take the sample, you take it in complete darkness, you maintain it in complete darkness, and then you test it, how many trapped electrons you found. And the dating lab has to know, like the latitude, longitude where you collected, to know what the radioactive content of the Earth is at that point, and how much exposure to the sun you have to account for cosmic rays.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated procedure, but very accurate and can go very far into. You can go much further than with carbon dating. The next slide shows why it's irrelevant to dating Carolina bays. This is another one of my experiments, okay? I said, okay, so you have formation of a cavity by an impact. Now, you have sun exposure. This is that little red dirt, red sand that I put on there. And then as the cavity gets reduced in size, no other portion of this terrain got exposed to light at the time of formation of the Carolina Bay.
Right.
So if you're going to test 1 meter under that red sand, what are you going to test? You're going to test old terrain. You're going to test the things that were there long before the Carolina Bays were formed. And so you end up with a mishmash of dates that do not correspond to the time of formation of the Carolina Bays.
Yeah, because what you're testing is how long or the last time it was exposed to light. Yeah, that's what you capture with this. This is why it's interesting for megalithic stuff too. But
yeah, which works very fine for the positional processes.
Yep.
But not for impact processes.
Yeah,
so,
and particularly with liquefaction.
What we have to do is get people to believe that Carolina Bays were created by impacts, so they don't apply this method to them.
Trying to date to them. Yeah. Right. It's a fundamental. Right, as you say, it's kind of this fundamental thing. If you think it's just aeolian, it's wind, and then you don't have the perturbance of the soil and liquefaction, then sure, go and test it. But the people that do test it seem to come up with these wildly dissimilar dates, which, I mean, everything seems to be leaning towards your hypothesis from this. That's what's interesting about this.
Well, what I have tried to do is design experiments that try to counter some of the major objections to the hypothesis. Basically, the dating is one of the major objections.
It is, and that's the reason it's not the controversy around that's why it's not in the Younger Dryas papers now and that type of thing.
Right, but if we can say that the Carolina Bays were created by impacts, and that radiocarbon dating is subject to all this variability, and that the optical stimulated luminescence doesn't work because you're testing the subsurface. Yep. Then you're not getting the right date, for the correct event. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the next slide gets into the extinction. Okay. And I'm going to give you a challenge. Okay. This is 35 kilometers southwest of Fayetteville. And notice toward the bottom of the picture next to the grid line that shows the scale, there's that big bay that is 4 kilometers long. This is the one that I told you required that one right there.
Yep.
That one required an energy of 1,000 or more than 1,200 megatons of energy to create. Now, all these other ones are 13 kilotons, 3 megatons, and so forth. Okay, now choose a place where you could have stood there and survived.
There's nowhere on this picture that you would survive that. It's the fallout from these things would have. I mean, yeah.
Saturation, bombardment. Okay, and this is why I say that the creation of the Carolina Bays was the cause of the extinction of the megafauna. There is no place, no habitat that was untouched.
Yeah.
And, if you try to survive, there's no place to survive. And even if you did, your habitat is ruined. You don't know where to get food, so you'll starve.
Yeah, there's so many effects. I think this is in this area, this ice bombardment totally would have done it. In other areas where if there was, say, an impact into dirt, I mean, just the fact the air would have been turned to mud from the fallout, the rain out. I mean, one of the things that surprised me the most about that southern Chile Younger Dryas paper, and this is the southern hemisphere, 80% of we talk about 50% generally of the megafauna getting wiped out as a general global result of the Younger Dryas, but in South America, it was 80% of megafauna got wiped out. I mean,
Right.
this is all as a result of either direct impact issues like this, where you have direct fallout, direct damage, but then it's just massive climate change. I mean, the figures I saw quoted in that study was like 10% of the biomass on the planet was on fire, which is just, we've never seen anything remotely like this. You're talking about,
No.
Randall Carlson's done some great work looking at actual wildfires that can become as a direct result of comet airbursts and things. Just, yeah, this is why I have no trouble at all saying that if there was an advanced civilization, so getting back to my general wheelhouse of topics, but if there was an advanced civilization, they're gone. Like it changed the surface of the Earth this period.
That's right.
And in some cases did it rapidly. And we're part of the megafauna. Like if we would have been knocked around severely as a species.
The Clovis people disappeared. The Clovis culture was gone.
It does make you wonder, like, all these underground cities in Turkey and Cappadocia, like a couple that were able to take like hundreds of thousands of people. You wonder why people were underground. I mean, I think there's some reasons.
Maybe they had some reason. Yes. Yeah. But see, in this picture, you can see from the top right corner, sort of going down to the middle, toward the scale line, you see a little wavy, thin wavy line.
Yep.
See, that's I-95. And the straight line is a railroad line.
This here is I-95, and then this is the railroad line. Yeah. And in fact, the more you zoom in on this, the more you can see, like, you're just seeing some of the outlines of the big ones too, that there is just no end of like little, just tons of little bombardments. Yeah, this is.
And again,
a bad day.
Anybody who wants to see these pictures for themselves, they can go to the cintos.org website of Michael Davies and download the overlays for the Google Earth. Okay.
Yeah,
so everybody can be an explorer of the Carolina Bays. Now, the next slide shows some of the differences. See, notice on the left we see North Carolina, on the right we see Maryland. And so for a while I had to think, okay, I figured out how those that were on the border of South Carolina that looked like guitar picks. Okay. Now here in Maryland, they are circular. Why? Well, it turns out that about 35 or 33 million years ago, there was an impact on the Chesapeake Bay. Which washed away a lot of the sand covering on the peninsula, on the Delmarva Peninsula. And so
impacts into
when you have just a thin layer of sand or unconsolidated ground, any impact is explosive and creates a circular crater. And so this is what we have in Maryland, in the Delmarva Peninsula.
Because it's under like harder ground, there's only limited...
yes, you cannot create a conical cavity.
Right. Yeah.
And so, again, I have tried to look at different aspects and try to see how people will look and criticize the glacier ice impact hypothesis, try to cover all the bases. And this is one of the things that we have to look at.
Yeah.
Okay, the next slide. The next slide.
Yeah.
Talks about the Alton Farms mastodon. Randall Carlson has done a very good description of all the mammoths and mastodons and mass graves in Russia and so forth. And this, I think, would be very typical of what would have happened if an animal like a mastodon had been hit by a shard of ice.
You're moving at 4 kilometers a second,
Yeah, the skeleton proved to be badly disturbed and the bones crushed and broken. As an example of the amount of disturbance, one of the ribs lay beneath one of the tusks, while another was thrust through an aperture in the pelvis. A shoulder blade rested to the right of the skull, and one of the large neck vertebrae was found about 10 feet from the skull. near a portion of the pelvis. In spite of the wide dislocation of the parts, the bones of one of the feet remained intact and in place, very possibly in the spot where the animal last stepped. In other words, the feet stayed in place.
Yeah, and it just got
the rest
of it just got exploded.
Yes.
Yeah, crazy.
And so I think there was another example like this in New York with badly disturbed features, and there was no evidence of predation. Okay, so
right, yeah, that's the silly theory with the megafauna extinctions that we seem to cling to in some components, that it was us that did it, which is kind of ridiculous. But I'm trying to remember. There's definitely another example. I remember he talked about there's like a cave where you have it's almost as if like a giant like a sonic speed sort of tidal wave of mud and ice hit these animals in a cave, and it's literally smashed up saber-toothed tigers, mastodons, and trees that are all just completely mashed up inside a cave. I'm not sure where that was. I'm trying to track down that specific quote, actually, but I know of another, the Drachenloch cave in Europe. I think it's Austria. It might be the Drachenloch cave. It's something like 50,000 cave bear remains in it. It's an incredible amount. I think if all these cave bears were running from something and they all died in this cave, and there's like, it's a huge cave, but there's some astronomical number of cave bear remains in this one cave, and that's one of the species that went extinct at the end of the Younger Dryas. But yeah, it's we didn't do this to them. Like small, limited numbers of people, small Paleo-Indian people hunting. I mean, I've been to the Serengeti, and that's the modern analog for how dense the megafauna was. And we aren't doing that. And a lot of those animals were much larger and much more aggressive. You know.
I posted a picture that I found at the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico, showing some modern humans hunting with spears, mastodon, showing a lot of injuries. And I thought,
yeah, you think?
Well,
yeah. Right.
So it's not likely that they were defenseless. So the next, which is my last slide, basically asks the question if multiple impacts came from comet fragments. Well, Greenland crater under the Hiawatha Glacier has a very wide range of dates. So it does, and it's too far away to have caused the megafaunal extinction. So maybe that was not associated with the Younger Dryas, although it's still possible that dating will come there. The Saginaw Bay, like I show in the middle picture, is not a real crater in the normal sense. But one of the things that I think is interesting is that Saginaw Bay and the deepest point of Huron Lake are perfectly aligned. And you can see some of these arc features that look almost like compression waves, as you might see them in a bullet, right? The wavefront of a bullet, shockwave of a bullet. And finally, the Turalde crater in Bolivia. Now, this could be the reason for the megafaunal extinction in South America. And this one has been dated to a date that could be Younger Dryas.
Oh, really? I don't know anything about this. I'm going to have to do a bit of research.
Yeah, look it up in Wikipedia. Yeah. It's around the crater. And I don't know why it's not investigated more, but it certainly... it has the proper time. It's small enough that it could have been an airburst or small impact. And because it's in South America, it has the potential to have killed a lot of megafauna.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I've not seen that before, but that's, I mean, this is interesting.
Well, what I'm trying to do is put everything together. At this point, I'm not trying to associate, let me say it another way. I have tried to supplement the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis by proposing the glacier ice impact hypothesis, which explains the Carolina bays and actually offers some physical evidence, macroscopic evidence of an impact in Saginaw Bay.
Yeah, I've like I said, I've been a fan of your work for several years now, and I want to encourage everybody that's watching this to please check out Antonio's YouTube channel, because he's got a great series of videos that get into all these subjects, that summarize them, that go through the various experiments that he's done, as well as his findings. Yeah, and it's. I think you're doing great work. You're really moving that picture forward. I hope that there's some more debate and some more recognition of what you're doing, because I think the thing you said to me the other day is that the Carolina Bays seem almost criminally underserved as a component of this discussion, and I think you're on the right track. I'm just a punter on the sideline making YouTube videos about all of this, and to me the Younger Dryas represents just a huge just clangor that sits in the middle of our story of history. It really upsets the apple cart when it comes to what our history is, our civilization, and where we've got to where we are today. And it's funny, you talk about doing geology courses. I started off just looking at history and ancient history, but the more you get into that topic, trying to peel back the layers, the more it becomes this question of geology. I think there's a lot of a debate and there's a whole academic fight going on, it seems to me, in geology. You've got folks like yourself and Randall Carlson certainly doing things that are really challenging what's been the establishment picture, and there's a history there as well with the Age of Enlightenment, the whole science of geology trying to get away from catastrophism and this idea of these biblical catastrophes, which there's this kernel of truth in them, and we try to use gradualism and uniformitarianism to explain everything, and geologists, we don't really like to think about things that may have happened as a result of a single catastrophic event, yet it seems like that's the most elegant and simple way to explain a lot of the phenomena that we're seeing, and it fits inside the big picture. So.
One way in which I think science is failing us today is that Michael Davies is not a geologist. He is a computer person. I am a computer person with chemistry background.
I'm a computer person.
And not a geologist. Randall Carlson, who is doing such magnificent... yes. And where are the professionals who are supposed to be doing this work? To me, they are doing a disservice to science by not working on something that is so significant for our history.
Yeah, I agree, and it's there's I think it's systemic, I think, across the fields, because you have the same issue in Egyptology and archaeology, which it's hard to argue are the same as some of these really firm sciences which have hypothesis, experiment, result. I think archaeology, history fields are closer to language and arts studies. You are trying to interpret things that are written, but you have the same issue. It's in some ways it's like this lack of the ability to really open up your mind to consider all these perspectives, and just follow the evidence to where it leads. There's a lot of I understand how these things happen with the institutional nature of it, and then when money gets involved and it's careers and paychecks and how science gets funded. I know there's some challenges with the way we do it today, but it takes people like yourself who I should remind everyone too, you're completely independent. You do all of this work on your own. You're not part of any larger groups, but and that's fantastic. It's guys like you that I think are really pushing the discussion forward now. So
I think one of the problems also is that this is a multidisciplinary problem.
Yeah.
In order to, in order to understand like Carolina Bays, you need to know geology, you need to know astronomy, you need to know physics, you need to know thermodynamics, and so to get one person who knows all this and knows how to put it together, hey, thank you very much.
yeah, that's a nice cue. Yeah, that was a good little lightning. But that's you're right. That's what it takes, and it is a complicated picture too. Like, it's a complicated story, and it has a lot of nuance to the discussion. I know there's a lot of. I love watching your work is great. I'm sure you've probably had discussions with Dabbler's Den. There's another YouTube channel I want to give a shout out to that does great videos on the Younger Dryas, and he spends a ton of time looking at the LiDAR imagery and the evidence for catastrophic floods. There's some really good Younger Dryas information out there on YouTube. It's just this seems to be where a lot of the discussion happens now. It's in these areas which. It's not in the academic halls in a lot of cases, and I can understand. I'm a little bit sympathetic because I can understand that if you were an academic, it's easier for more people to have a voice now, and it's hard. It must be hard to kind of push back against a lot of it, and it probably leads them towards being very definitive and sort of saying discussion's over. It's there's nothing else to see here, and it's like, well, there is. I can understand how you end up in that position, but
I started working on this at the peak of negativity, following that Requiem paper, and I have a little apology in my book that says, "Hey, by all, it should probably have been a professional geologist who came up with this hypothesis, but." Because of the negativity associated with it, they just left it open.
Yeah, right. It's don't touch it. The subject's too hot. You don't want to go there with your research. Find something else that you're likely to get funded to do. Yeah, I understand. But I mean, I want to commend you and thank you for the work you're doing because I personally have gotten a tremendous amount from it. Your work's one of the main reasons that I am trying to do what I'm doing because I think it's an important piece in the puzzle of finding out the truth about our history, and that's something that I'm always obsessed with, and thank you for doing what you do. It's great, and thanks for talking to me as well.
It's been nice talking to you.
Cheers.